If you are a long-term fan of the History Guy, then you've seen cameos from the History Guy's cats. In fact, if we were to look at the homes of the few of us who work for the History Guy, the number of cats far outnumbers the number of people. To paraphrase Mark Twain, there are some who scorn a cat and think it not essential, but the History Guy tribe are not of these. I also tend to agree with Mark Twain's sentiment that if a man loves cats, then I am his friend and comrade without further introduction. But one downside, of course, of owning pets is that pets, like all living things, don't live forever, and we have lost 3 of our dear feline companions over the course of time that I have been the History Guy. But back in 2021, we adopted 2 newcomers to the house, Pocky and Strudel, courtesy of the St. Clair County Animal Adoption Center. And that led me to the question, how long have such centers been around? The history of animal adoption centers or humane societies or pounds deserves to be remembered. There is ample evidence of pets of many types, including cats and dogs, throughout the ancient world. Moreover, there is evidence that the care of such animals was important to many ancient societies. The World History Encyclopedia explains that in ancient Persia, after death, the soul crossed the Shinvat Bridge, where it was judged. If the soul had lived a righteous life in accordance with the precepts of truth, it was rewarded with paradise in the house of song. If it had wasted its life in pursuit of self-interest and evil, it was dropped into the hell of the house of lies. How one had treated dogs was a significant consideration in where the soul would go, and killing a dog guaranteed one a place in the house of lies. The 5th century Greek historian Herodotus noted that dogs and cats were so revered in Egypt that the family was expected to mourn their passing. All the inhabitants of a house where a cat had died a natural death shave their eyebrows, and when a dog dies, they shave the whole body, including the head. Cats which have died are taken to Bubastis, where they are embalmed and buried in sacred receptacles. Dogs are buried in sacred burial places in the cities where they belong. Respect for dogs and cats was so important to the ancient Egyptians that the 2nd century Greek historian Plinius recorded that when a 5th century BC Persian general herded animals, including cats and dogs, in front of his army, the Egyptians surrendered rather than harm the animals. Pets were certainly kept and prized by ancient Greeks and Romans as well, and are often depicted in art as companions of gods. However, it's not clear that they had the same feeling about protecting the animals as the Egyptians. The website Many Pets notes that for Romans, if an animal was accepted as a pet, it meant a life of luxury and care. Otherwise, it would end up as a sacrifice in the arena or in a hunting game. The use of animal cruelty, notably in the Roman arenas, might have been representative of a philosophy towards animals espoused by Aristotle. In his 4th century BC book, History of Animals, Aristotle originated the study of animals and classification of animal types. The book touches on the ethics of animal treatment in that he argued that animals have purpose, and thus stock persons can turn animals to human purpose best by promoting positive welfare states. However, he concluded that animal purpose is to serve humans, or in brief, plants are created for the sake of animals, and animals for the sake of men. Thus, in his observation-based classification of living things, he theorized a scala naturae, or scale of nature. The 2009 edition of the Encyclopedia of Neuroscience explains, Aristotle's idea was that living things could be assigned a hierarchical position on this metaphorical ladder that would represent their degree of perfection. That was in contrast to the ideas of the Greek mathematician Pythagoras, who theorized that humans and non-humans had the same kind of soul, and that one spirit pervades the universe and makes us one with animals. It was the Aristotelian perspective, amplified by the Neoplatonists, that prevailed, and the concept of the scale of nature would develop within the context of European Christianity with the concept of the great chain of being, a hierarchical structure decreed by God, placing God at the top, followed by angels, then people, then animals, then plants, and finally minerals. The great chain essentially perpetuated the idea that the purpose of animals was to benefit people, and so the welfare of animals was not a consideration. And all of that means is that for many centuries there wasn't a lot of thought about animal welfare in Europe or in their colonies here in the Americas. Animals were considered to be lower than humans, and so their purpose was merely to serve us. The idea of an organization dedicated to the promotion of animal welfare seems to have started in England in 1824, with the formation of a society for the prevention of cruelty to animals. In 1822, Parliament had passed the Cruel Treatment of Cattle Act, one of the first modern pieces of legislation preventing animal cruelty. It was made illegal for any person to wantonly and cruelly beat or ill-treat any horse, mare, gelding, mule, ass, ox, cow, heifer, steer, sheep, or other cattle. The SPCA was created for the purpose of enforcing the act. The Society's webpage writes that founded in the London coffee shop in 1824, the men present knew they were creating the world's first animal welfare charity, but they couldn't have imagined the size and shape that the charity would become today. While early legislation supported by the organization tended to focus on livestock, the Cruelty to Animals Act of 1835 provided a fine for any person who shall wantonly and cruelly beat, ill-treat, abuse, or torture any horse, mare, gelding, bull, ox, cow, heifer, steer, calf, mule, ass, sheep, lamb, dog, or any other cattle or domestic animal. And in 1849, the Cruelty to Animals Act extended the protection to any animal. The Society advocated several acts regarding animal cruelty. It was given a royal charter by Queen Victoria in 1840, becoming the Royal Society for the Protection and Care of Animals, and helped to inspire organizations in the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. The American version was started in 1866 thanks to Henry Bergh, heir to a wealthy New York shipbuilder. In 1862, Bergh was appointed by Abraham Lincoln to the U.S. delegation to Tsarist Russia. In his travels in Europe, he witnessed terrible cruelty to animals, but in England met the president of the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Inspired, he returned to the United States. Writing in the 2020 edition of the journal The Conversation, author Ernest Freeberg explained, motivated less by the love of animals than by a hatred of human cruelty, he used his wealth, connections, and literary talents to lobby New York's legislature to pass the nation's first modern anti-cruelty statute. There was little protection for animals in the United States previously. The laws that existed were generally written around protecting an animal's commercial value. For example, an 1846 Vermont law read, "Every person who shall willfully and maliciously kill, wound, maim, or disfigure any horse or horses or horse kind, cattle, sheep, or swine of another person, or shall willfully or maliciously administer poison to any such animal, shall be punished by imprisonment of not more than 5 years or fined not exceeding $500. The Animal Legal and Historical Center of Michigan State University explains there was no provision prohibiting the cruel treatment of the animals, the word not being found in the statute. The list of animals protected was limited to commercially valuable animals, not pets or wild animals. The purpose of this law was to protect commercially valuable property from the interference of others, not to protect animals from pain and suffering. In fact, a judge's ruling in an 1856 case regarding a similar law in Minnesota argued that a dog would not have been protected. It seems to me that all animals, such as have in law no value, were not intended to be included. Quite the opposite, unattended dogs were often perceived as a nuisance. According to the website Sniffing the Past, Dogs in History, in 1811 the Common Council of New York passed a law concerning dogs that required that dogs be registered and allowed anyone to kill any stray dog or any dog suspected of having bitten someone. By the 1830s, the city started offering a bounty for strays in an attempt to clean up the streets, which led to the widespread slaughter of dogs, and then concerned that people, often children, who made a living killing dogs for their bounty, might turn out to become violent criminals. In 1866, the New York State Legislature passed what has been described as the nation's first effective animal anti-cruelty law. The legislature gave a charter to Mr. Bergh to form an American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, tasked with enforcing the new law, but the law was limited to the treatment of draft horses. Every owner, driver, or possessor of an old, maimed, or diseased horse or mule turned loose or left disabled in any street, lane, or place of any city in the state for more than 3 hours shall be adjudged guilty of a misdemeanor. Bergh used his society to advocate much further. While he did not exactly gain universal approval for his ideas, Freeberg writes that many observers scoffed at the suggestion that animals should enjoy legal protection. He created a national dialogue with newspaper discussions involving issues from vivisection to the practice of chaining up milk cows, to the way the P.T. Barnum Animal Museum fed their snakes. It was during an 1872 epidemic of horse flu that he was able to gain the most attention, standing in the middle of busy New York streets and inspecting animals for infection. If he found sick horses being forced to work, he sent them home. Freeberg notes that transit companies threatened to sue him, but his action gained attention and spurred national debate. Back in the United Kingdom, the issue of animal cruelty had developed further. In 1860, an animal rights advocate named Mary Tealby had opened the temporary home for lost and starving dogs in the London borough of Holloway. In his 2011 book, A Home of Their Own, author Gary Jenkins noted the impressions of a reporter from the Belfast newsletter who visited the home. Here I found about 40 unhappy little dogs, all of the class termed street curs. They yelped and roared and pushed their noses through the bars of their cages as if a visit from a stranger was quite an event in their lives. The news story was favorable, although the reporter bemoaned that the home only included dogs, as cats surely have claims of nearly equal urgency. The shelter, which after relocating in 1871 would become known as the Battersea Dogs Home, started accepting cats in 1883. The purpose of the shelter was to give temporary care until the owners of lost animals or new owners could be found, but the home also did humanely dispose of animals when necessary. Over time, attitudes towards the care of animals changed, partly because of the efforts of the home, which gained famous support from Charles Dickens. In 1883, the Duke of Albany visited Battersea and took home a terrier named Skippy. Queen Victoria, the Duke's mother, became a royal patron in 1885. And just like the United Kingdom, the creation of such shelters in the United States started with a woman. Carolyn Earl White was born to a wealthy Pennsylvania Quaker family in 1833. Her father was a successful lawyer and abolitionist, her mother an abolitionist and suffragette, first cousin of the noted social reformer and women's rights advocate Lucretia Mott. Author Diane Beers, writing in her 2006 work For the Prevention of Cruelty, The History and Legacy of Animal Rights Activism in the United States, notes that the political ideology and activism of the Earl household greatly influenced Caroline. She became a successful writer, publishing travel guides and well-regarded novels. Providing with a good education and eventually marrying a wealthy attorney, she took on many of the causes of her day: women's suffrage, abolition, aid to underprivileged children, the temperance movement, and, chief among them, animal rights. Beers writes, as a child, she had frequently witnessed the physical abuse many drivers inflicted upon the fatigued draft animals that pulled heavy freight down Philadelphia's Market Street. In 1866, she went to New York to meet Berg, who gave advice about starting a Philadelphia Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Berg put her in touch with other people advocating for the society, but despite her efforts that were central to its foundation, when the society was founded in 1868, she was left off the list of officers. It seems that the society that was so progressive in the pursuit of rights for animals was not so progressive regarding the role of women. The website of Canada Pet Food explains it was fine for women to be involved in causes, but it was up to men to run them. Frustrated by being limited in her role, in 1869 she joined 29 other women and created the Women's Pennsylvania Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, or WPSPCA. According to the Philadelphia Inquirer, in 1869, the women's branch of the Pennsylvania Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals opened in Philadelphia as the nation's first animal shelter. The shelter started with a city pound. Shelters are still often called pounds, referring to the fenced areas where unattended animals were once impounded. Before the WPSPCA, the impounded animals were given no protection. There was no program for the public to adopt the animals, and they were often used by doctors for performing medical experiments. The women took over the pound and prevented doctors from experimenting on the animals. The shelter's mission was to provide, as soon as possible, a refuge for lost and homeless dogs, where they could be kept until homes could be found for them, or they be otherwise disposed of. The center is still operational and serves as Buck County, Pennsylvania's only open intake shelter, offering adoption, training, and veterinary services. However, the early shelters were different than what we see today. The focus was more on humane euthanasia than adoption and animal population control. The website Paws Chicago explains these traditional shelters were founded in the late 1800s as a response to the government's method of controlling animal overpopulation: clubbing, shooting, or drowning homeless cats and dogs. Traditional private shelters stepped in and offered more humane death to homeless animals. For more than a century, traditional private humane societies followed a cage-and-kill operating model. This meant that they took in all animals and killed the surplus. The American enthusiasm for pets grew significantly in the post-World War II boom, when Time magazine notes pets became seen as part of the quintessential suburban American family. The website of Hill Rose Pet Resort explains that during the 1960s and 1970s, public opinion about strays started to shift, and people began to view them as potential pets rather than public health hazards. And the website DVM360 writes that in the late 1970s, enough concern about the quality of life offered to shelter animals was raised that veterinary input was sought to provide effective programs of preventive care and treatment. According to the No Kill Advocacy Center, today 96% of Americans report a moral duty to protect animals, and that states should support laws that do so. Animal adoption shelters in the United States are a mix of municipal shelters, funded mostly by local taxes and license fees, private shelters, which are often not-for-profit organizations funded by donations, and various special rescue groups and sanctuaries. DVM 360 notes that the ASPCA National Outreach Department estimates that more than 5,000 animal shelters exist in the United States. However, no one knows for sure, since there's no federal system to define or regulate shelters. Humane societies and SPCAs are not affiliated with the national ASPCA or the Humane Society of the United States. While animal shelters are not the primary source of pets in the United States, their importance is growing. Time noted that among pet dogs, the percentage adopted from shelters increased from 15% in 2006 to over 35% in 2016. The ASPCA estimates that some 3.2 million shelter animals are adopted each year, and another 710,000 animals that arrive in shelters are successfully returned to their owners. But another 1.5 million shelter animals are still euthanized on average in a year, although the number has decreased. Shelters today often include services like pet training and public education and veterinary services in addition to adoption services. And of course, animal welfare groups play myriad roles in society well beyond these animal adoption centers. And since the 1970s, in addition to adoption, there's been a greater focus on addressing the core problem of pet overpopulation. Spay and neuter technology has been around and widely available since the 1930s, but it wasn't well advertised, and it wasn't until the 1970s that Time magazine notes that spay and neuter technology became more widely used, and that animal welfare organizations like the Humane Society of the United States went with mottos like legislate, educate, sterilize in order to reduce the population of unwanted pets. And today, sterilization is almost universally a requirement if you want to adopt from a shelter in the United States. Of course, there have been various controversies surrounding shelters. There have been disagreements over policy. There's been some accusations of animal cruelty and problems with diseases being spread by overcrowded shelters. But the problem is simply massive. Mars Pet Care, according to most recent research, estimates that there are as many as 1.3 million stray dogs and 41 million stray cats in the United States. And if you want to make a difference, in every locality there are ample opportunities for people who want to volunteer their time or to make a donation. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you have to do is subscribe.